Katie, heading over to you. You know, when we discussed in the beginning, like for me, it's interesting. I realize I've been confronted with thinking about the future since early on in my career after university. I started in a tech company, and we were always you know, predicting and saying, oh, you know, this will happen and that technology will change everything. And that was in the 90s, and we did the same in the early 2000s, and we did it again in the early, you know, 2010s, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always this driver of innovation and change that was somehow promising the good, you know, for us to prosper, to thrive into this positive future. You're professionally, you know, in that industry. So give us a little insight. What are your thoughts, and how do you predict things? Like, how do you tell your clients what will happen?
Well, right now, and first of all, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. The first thing I would say that you probably may not expect me to say is that there is no point in trying to predict the future. And we've got into a position as a global society where we think we've beaten nature into submission to such an extent that we can now predict what happens next. And we've been doing that for about 250 years. And what is happening is nature is making the point that actually we don't control it, and that it is a deeply complex and emergent system. And we don't have the capabilities to understand it, let alone control it. So actually, you know, all this about, you know, climate change is a technology problem, as you hear again and again. This is based on this age-old idea, well, not age-old, going back to Descartes, really, I suppose, that says, as long as you can know as much as possible, then you can control everything. And this is effectively where the idea that artificial intelligence, super intelligent, artificial intelligence is suddenly going to, you know, change everything. The reality is that AI uses the past to predict the future. And actually, in perfectly certain narrow cases, that can be extremely useful. But the world is not a narrow use case. It's a massive, complex system, and it's very uncertain. And in uncertain situations, the priority is not to predict. The priority is to adapt. And that is why humans have been successful, not because we predicted things, but because we adapted to things. And I think it talks to what Jeremy was starting with there. You look back to the very early civilizations and societies. You know, what made humans unique was not necessarily their ability to use tools. It was not their ability to discover fire. What made humans unique was their ability to engage in delayed return activities. It was to know that actually, if you put a net across a stream at this time of year, you were going to catch fish, and the ability to know that a fish would go off during a certain period of time. So our relationship with the future, our ability to conceptualize the future, and our ability to create multiple potential futures that we could share with each other in enough detail that we could make decisions about which future we liked, that is our human superpower. So when we talk about futurists, you hear, you know, lots of futurists around today, and almost all of them are talking about technology. But the most important relationship we have as human beings is with our future. And that relationship with the future, and I think this is where there are lots of parallels with Jeremy's fantastic work. When you look at where we started out, our first search for patterns was in trying to understand what was going to come next. We looked at the stars to understand what that meant for nature. And we began belief systems that said, we have gods who have kind of a plan, but they give us clues. So we can still adapt to the future. We can actually influence our own futures. And then the axial age religions came along and said, no, there's one big God. He's got a plan for you. You've got no part in it. And essentially what's happening now, in my view, is that determinism, that religious determinism that is, you know, on shaky ground thanks to science. Science is now taking up that mantle. We've now got a technological determinism. So the end of the world used to be fire and brimstone, and now it's silicon hell. So what we've got is a tomorrow factory, which is basically following the same human pattern that we always have done. We have to have some great big God to be scared of that none of us can understand and none of us can influence. And on a very human, personal level, this impacts people, because it disempowers us. If you believe the future is basically all about technology and you don't understand technology, what part do you play in the future, right? And that's where I think it's a narrative that needs puncturing.